For decades, a quiet question has lingered around the figure of Benito Mussolini. Not about his rise to power, not about the violence of his regime, but about something more basic and more elusive. Where exactly did he come from? The man who presented himself as the embodiment of the Italian nation left behind a family history that was far less clear than his public image suggested. Records were thin, stories conflicted, and for much of the 20th century, the details remained just out of reach. Part of the difficulty lay in the nature of the evidence itself. Mussolini was born in 1883 in the small town of Predappio, in the Romagna region of northern Italy. Rural Italy at the end of the 19th century was a world of handwritten parish books, inconsistent civil registries, and local customs that often blurred the line between legal record and lived reality. Births were sometimes registered late. Fathers might be absent for work, illness, or political reasons. Names could shift in spelling or usage from one document to the next. By the time historians began to take a serious interest in Mussolini's ancestry, much of the paper trail was already fragmentary. What is known seems straightforward at first glance. Mussolini's father, Alessandro Mussolini, was a blacksmith, a socialist, and a volatile presence in his son's early life. His mother, Rosa Maltoni, was a schoolteacher, devoutly Catholic, disciplined where Alessandro was chaotic. Together, they formed the familiar portrait of ideological tension that later biographers would read as formative. But when scholars looked beyond this immediate family, certainty began to dissolve. Alessandro Mussolini himself came from a line of smallholding peasants and artisans. The Mussolini surname appears sporadically in parish records across the Romagna countryside in the early 19th century, but rarely with detail. Some entries list fathers without occupations. Others omit mothers' maiden names. In a few cases, baptisms appear without corresponding civil registrations, or with annotations added years later in different ink. These are not dramatic anomalies. They are typical of rural record-keeping of the period. Yet they leave gaps that later generations are tempted to fill with speculation. Those gaps became more charged as Mussolini's political persona hardened. As fascism developed, so did a carefully curated myth of origin. Mussolini was portrayed as a man of the people, rooted in the soil of Italy, descended from sturdy native stock. His regime celebrated rural virtue, Roman continuity, and an almost mystical connection between blood and nation. Official biographies emphasized simplicity and strength, while quietly avoiding genealogical detail beyond a few generations. There was no obvious scandal to conceal, but there was also no incentive to invite scrutiny. After the Second World War, interest in Mussolini's background took on a different tone. With the regime dismantled and its symbols discredited, historians began to re-examine the foundations of fascist identity. Some asked whether Mussolini's own family history contained contradictions similar to those found in other authoritarian leaders. A handful of writers suggested that Alessandro Mussolini's paternity was uncertain, or that the family line might include outsiders absorbed into local communities and later forgotten. These claims were rarely supported by hard evidence, but they circulated nonetheless, repeated more often than they were tested. Mainstream historians remained cautious. The prevailing view was that there was no compelling reason to doubt the conventional account. Alessandro Mussolini appeared consistently in local records as the son of his named father. No contemporary accusations of illegitimacy survived. No legal disputes hinted at a hidden lineage. In the absence of proof, speculation was set aside. The question of Mussolini's ancestry was left open, but largely unexamined. That changed in the early 21st century, when advances in genetics offered historians a new tool. DNA analysis had already begun to unsettle long-held assumptions in other historical cases. The idea that biology might clarify what documents could not was appealing, particularly in regions where written records were sparse. In Italy, several research groups began mapping genetic patterns across regions, tracing how populations had moved and mixed over centuries. Inevitably, attention turned toward famous figures whose identities had been politically charged. In Mussolini's case, the opportunity was limited. There was no confirmed biological material from him that could be tested directly. His remains had been moved, disturbed, and reburied multiple times in the chaotic years after 1945. What researchers could examine instead were samples from individuals claiming descent from the Mussolini paternal line. The assumption was cautious but clear. If those individuals genuinely shared an unbroken male lineage with Benito Mussolini, their Y chromosomes might offer clues about deeper ancestry. Early results were unremarkable at first glance. The haplogroups identified among putative male line relatives were common in southern and central Europe, particularly around the Mediterranean. They appeared in Italy, the Balkans, parts of Greece, and across the northern shores of Africa. This was not evidence of a specific origin so much as a reminder of the region's long history of migration and exchange. Italy, after all, has never been genetically isolated. Some commentators rushed ahead of the data. Brief articles suggested that Mussolini's ancestry was unexpected or surprising, without clarifying what expectation had been violated. Others implied connections that the data did not support, conflating ancient population movements with modern ethnic categories. Geneticists pushed back quickly. They pointed out that such haplogroups predated modern nations by tens of thousands of years. To carry them was to share a deep human history, not a hidden family secret. The more careful analyses emphasized uncertainty. Without a direct sample from Mussolini himself, every conclusion rested on assumptions about lineage continuity. A single undocumented adoption, affair, or clerical error in the 19th century could sever the genetic link. This was not a flaw in the science, but a limitation of its application. DNA could illuminate possibilities, but it could not resolve them conclusively. Still, the very act of testing had an effect. It reopened a question that had long been considered settled by default. It forced historians to confront how much of what we accept about personal origins rests on convention rather than proof. And it exposed the tension between genetic data and the political meanings people are eager to assign to it. As the genetic findings circulated quietly among specialists, historians began to respond in different ways. Some saw the data as confirmation of what they had long argued, that Mussolini's ancestry was, in broad terms, unexceptional. The genetic patterns identified among his supposed relatives fit comfortably within what is known about the population history of northern and central Italy. The Romagna region had seen waves of movement since antiquity, from Roman colonists to Lombard settlers, merchants, soldiers, and seasonal laborers. Any family rooted there for centuries would almost certainly carry a mixture of lineages that defied neat categorization. Others were less satisfied. They noted that the uncertainty surrounding parish records still mattered. If the documentary chain was weak, then genetic sampling based on that chain was also weak. A Y chromosome could tell you about a paternal line, but only if you were confident you were following the right one. In Mussolini's case, confidence was precisely what historians lacked. Alessandro Mussolini's birth record exists, but like many of its era, it offers little beyond a name and a date. Earlier generations fade quickly into partial entries and crossed-out annotations. The DNA, critics argued, risked giving a false sense of resolution. This disagreement remained largely academic until it intersected with public discussion. Popular history magazines and television programs began to frame the genetic research as revelatory. Headlines hinted that Mussolini's true ancestry had finally been uncovered, as though a single result could overturn decades of scholarship. Yet when pressed, the researchers themselves were careful. They stressed that no test had identified a specific outsider ancestor. No unexpected lineage had appeared. What the DNA showed was continuity, not disruption. The irony was hard to miss. Fascist ideology had placed enormous emphasis on ancestry, purity, and continuity. Mussolini spoke often of lineage, of Roman blood, of the eternal Italian people. Yet the scientific tools that later generations hoped might expose a contradiction instead revealed something far more mundane. His genetic profile, insofar as it could be inferred at all, placed him squarely within the tangled, overlapping history of the Mediterranean world. It neither confirmed nor dramatically undermined the myths he promoted. It simply ignored them. Ethical questions followed close behind. Several historians and geneticists warned against drawing psychological or moral conclusions from ancestry. To suggest that Mussolini's behavior could be explained by his genes or by some hidden origin risked repeating the very logic his regime had embraced. Biology, they argued, should not be used to excuse or pathologize political violence. The danger lay not in the data itself, but in how readily it could be bent to familiar narratives. There was also a practical concern. Once DNA entered historical discussion, it tended to crowd out other forms of evidence. Parish registers, letters, tax records, and oral histories could appear suddenly less authoritative than a laboratory result, even when that result was indirect and contingent. Several Italian scholars cautioned that genetic research should complement, not replace, archival work. In Mussolini's case, they noted the archives still had much to offer, even if they could not deliver certainty. By the late 2000s, the initial excitement had faded. No dramatic revision of Mussolini's family tree emerged. No hidden grandfather stepped out of the shadows. What remained was a clearer understanding of how fragile the question had always been. The mystery endured not because of a single missing fact, but because of the way history, politics, and identity had become entangled. Mussolini himself had been adept at exploiting that entanglement. He understood the power of origin stories, even as he kept his own deliberately vague. In public, he was the son of the nation. In private, his background remained local, ordinary, and largely undocumented. That contrast was not accidental. It was a reminder that political identities are constructed as much through omission as through declaration. What the DNA never delivered, and perhaps never could, was closure. The expectation that genetics might finally settle the question of Mussolini's origins rested on a misunderstanding of both history and science. DNA can illuminate patterns, suggest continuity, and rule out certain claims. It cannot reconstruct the social realities of a 19th century Italian village or explain the silences in its records. In this case, it narrowed the field without resolving it. That limitation is itself revealing. The fascination with Mussolini's ancestry says less about him than about the need to anchor historical figures in something tangible and biological. It reflects a lingering hope that ideology might be traced to blood, that belief might be exposed through lineage. Yet Mussolini's life resists that simplification. His radicalism was shaped by politics, circumstance, ambition, and opportunity, not by a single ancestral thread. There is a quiet irony in this. A man who spoke constantly of destiny and heritage left behind a family history that remains stubbornly incomplete. The archives hold fragments. The DNA offers probabilities. Neither provides the certainty his rhetoric demanded. In the end, the story circles back to where it began, not with revelation, but with restraint. Mussolini's ancestry remains in important ways ordinary and unresolved. The science did not expose a hidden truth so much as it confirmed the limits of what can be known, and perhaps that is the most fitting conclusion. The past does not always yield to investigation. Sometimes it simply reminds us that history is made not only of answers, but of questions that refuse to disappear.